Welcome to the third video presentation in the series on understanding the Universal Business Language. This presentation will deal with the structures used in UBL. First thing to look at is what is a document structure. In UBL, document structures are aggregates. They are composites of other elements. A UBL document type is really the root of what's called the document tree. The schema for a UBL document type refers to components that are in a common library. They are either aggregate components that form the branches or basic components that form the leaves of the document tree. What we're describing is really the model of the document. Technically, it comprises of several XML schema components. The document model contains the common aggregate components and the common basic components. Basic components are made up of data types. In addition, there is an extension mechanism within UBL that's part of another presentation on customization. So for the moment, we'll ignore that element of the architecture. So let's have a look at some common components. This is actually a simplified model of the UBL common components. Its purpose is really to highlight the interrelationship of many of the components and the fact that underneath all of this there is a common framework, a semantic model that describes how these components relate to each other. I'm going to focus in this presentation on 7 commonly used components: party, item, delivery, currency, payment, tax, and document reference. So let's start by looking at what we mean by party. A party isn't really the thing that's in the bottom right-hand corner in a UBL context. A party is either a person or an organization, an entity participating in a trading or business relationship. And parties perform different roles. They can be buyers, sellers, importers, payees, manufacturers, freight forwarders. The party structure itself contains information regarding addresses and locations and contexts and tax details. We'll have a look at some of those in a minute. Let's go right in and have a look at what the UBL schema, the structure of a party, is. And if we look at the red components, the elements, the text marked in red, we can see that it has things like mark care, mark attention, website, logo, reference, endpoint. Some of the interesting ones, or probably more recognizable ones, are things like party identification, party name, postal address, contact person, financial account. You'll also possibly notice that some of these texts are preceded by CBC and a colon, or CAC and a colon. That's a mark to tell you that this is a basic component. A CBC is a common basic component, and a CAC is a common aggregate. And what that means is that the common aggregates can be broken down into further structures. The CBC, the common basic components, are the leaves. They are the elemental parts of the language. So they don't break down any further. So I said before that parties perform different roles: sellers, buyers, manufacturers, freight forwarders, final delivery party, payee, tax representative, and accounting party. There is a chart within the UBL specification that describes all of the various party roles and how they participate and what processes they participate in. There are several ways that roles are identified. The most obvious one is what we call qualifying the party. And the example I'll use here is in a purchase order where there are three types of customer. There is the buyer party customer, the originator, the person who actually originated the request, and the accounting customer party, the party who's actually going to organize the payments. So if we zoom in a little bit on this, we can see that we've qualified the relationship by giving it a name: buyer, originator, and accounting. So customer party is being qualified as a buyer when it participates in an order. So the qualification is very specific to a one relationship. In addition, we can extend the structure of a party for specific roles. So a customer party may in fact have more information, require more information than a normal standard party role. So when I'm playing the role of a customer, I need more information. And we can see some of this here. We need a customer assigned account ID, and we possibly have different contacts when we're a customer. And the same applies in the party for supplier qualifying as well. So supplier party and customer party are extended structures beyond the normal party. So here's the party, it's contained within the other two. If we look at the schema for this, we can see how it actually plays out. Customer party has various components, one of which is the party itself, the normal reused party that's used in other party structures. And you can see how there are additional elements that are extensions of that structure. And they are different for the customer and different for the supplier party. I mentioned that parties contain information about locations and addresses, and it's worth having a look, because this is a very common structure, at the address type. So the address structure in UBL contains many of the things you'd expect to see: the postal details, rooms, street names, blocks, buildings, cities, subdivisions, postal zones, regions, countries. And in addition, UBL supports the idea of an address line. And an address line is for the situation where you don't require a structured address, or you don't necessarily know the structured address. And so you just put lines of text to describe the address. Let's put all those things together and have a look at an example. And in fact, this has been used in other scenarios too. So here's a definition of a buyer-customer party. So we can see, as we mentioned, buyer-customer party has extra information that's not in the normal party structure, such as customer assigned account ID. Here is the normal party structure, and the party structure has a name and a postal address. And here are the components of the address we're using. You've probably noticed that the examples are much simpler than the schema. There's a lot more in the schema that is optional. You don't have to use all of those components. And that's what we're seeing here. We've also created an address line here, an unstructured address, just to show you what it looks like. So these are the party details, and these are the address details. Another very key part of any business vocabulary is how you describe items. or products. We use the term items in UBL. And items can be goods or services. We like to often think of them as goods, but the same applies to any services as well. First thing about items is it's actually very difficult to have a standardized way of identifying them. This is very context dependent. So UBL allows items to be referenced from a catalogue, identified by names or descriptions, or any identification scheme, and there are many of them. The other thing about item information is it is contextualized, so the things you need to know about an item will depend upon the context or the business process that they're participating in. So let's have a look at the schema, the structure of item. And again, most of the elements within the structure are self-explanatory. One of the things to highlight here, as I mentioned before, is how many identification schemes are allowed. So we provide for buyer, seller, manufacturer a standard, a catalogue, but we also provide what's called an additional item reference, which is an unbounded, in other words, you can have as many as you like of these, which is for the situation where you've got very specific identification schemes that don't fit into any of the other categories. So you can see that when we deal with item, most of what we're dealing with here is trying to get some sort of precise focus on what that item is. You may have noticed in the schema before that the item identification is actually a structure in its own right. And that's because there are several elements that can be used to identify an item, such as the physical dimensions of the size or the weights of the thing. There's also barcoding and the different symbologies that involves. So item identification actually involves more than just an identification scheme. There's various properties about that scheme we may need to know. So what you're looking at here is the item identification structure. Let's have a look at a couple of examples of this. The first is the one we've used in our other scenarios, which is the beeswax description. And we can see it's identified primarily by its name, and it has a buyer and a seller item identification. The second example is using a identification scheme provided by GS1 known as GTIN. So there is a name for the item, but the significant identification, which is used by the seller in this context, is this number here, a GTIN number, and that will relate to a precise description of the item. I mentioned earlier that in a catalogue scenario, the information about an item can be quite complex. And this is an example of a mobile phone. Again, we've got the various identification schemes. We have also got, in this case, a commodity classification. So this helps to identify the particular commodity that mobile phone corresponds to. And in this case, it's the UNSPSC code 431915001. Another key feature of being able to identify items is for traceability. In various industries, the fast-moving consumer goods, agricultural products, pharmaceutical products, engineering, and even high-value artifacts, all require some method of tracing the item as it passes through a supply chain. This often relates to a specific instance of an item. And what we mean by this is that there are cases where knowing a generic item like a mobile phone is not enough. You actually have to specifically identify one instance of that item, a particular mobile phone. And this applies in areas like pharmaceuticals and foodstuffs, used cars, works of art, where there is only one of these objects. And of course, things like houses, real estate. Just knowing the commodity is not enough. You need to identify the particular instance. The little graphic here is because about 10 years ago, I lost my dog. And when I advertised if somebody had seen my dog, I didn't just want any dog, I wanted that particular dog. Now, had I not been concerned and just wanted any dog, then I could have just used an item to describe it. And items are used where there is mass-produced items, so new cars, media, new furniture. It's not that particular chair you want, it's that particular style of chair. So when we talk about item instances, there's a lot of information about the life cycle and the traceability of that object. So this is the schema for item instance, and you can see it has its trace identifiers, which various schemes exist. It has things like best before, manufactured date, and it has the identification of the lot in cases of batched products. So item instances become useful for individual products where only one can satisfy it. And it's supported by other technologies, this functionality of warranty or traceability. And RFID is a typical technology for tracking item instances. I mentioned before that sometimes we're just interested in the commodity, and there are different ways of classifying or identifying the commodity. In public procurement schemes, there's often a formal commodity classification to ensure that they are comparing apples to apples. Different classification schemes exist for different purposes. So in a cross-border regulatory sense, many customs agencies, or all customs agencies, use what's called the harmonized code system for identifying the products for security and duty reasons. We've already seen an example of a code known as UNSPSC for procurement items. And UBL provides what's called the commodity classification structure, which allows you to define the nature of the goods, the type of cargo for when it's shipped, the commodity type itself, and if there is an item classification that goes with it. Typically, an item will have many commodity classifications. It just depends which context you're using it in. And if the commodity classification is not enough, you can also use what's called the item property structure. So this is where there are peculiarities to that particular type of product that really mean you need to know some more information about it. Ad hoc products like in the building industry where you're ordering timbers would be a case where this might apply. So you need to know things about that we don't know, that we can't standardize on how these things properties exist. So we have what's called a value quantity and a value qualifier. What it is, how much of it, and what it is that we're measuring it by. So this is really useful for those situations where you can't get enough information in the standard item structure. The way that items are used in a business transaction also affects the amount of information we need. So items can be reused in different contexts, and a typical case is where you're describing an item in terms of an order, or in terms of an invoice, or in terms of a catalogue, and there is different information. So it's information about items is very dependent on the specific transaction, and so it's not always the same information for the same item. Some things vary, like the quantity required, the price, the tax, the delivery details. These are not properties that are dependent on the item itself. You will order different quantities and they'll come at different prices and pay different taxes and be delivered to different places. So these are not what is called functionally dependent on the item. They are dependent upon the transaction the item participates. And UBL addresses this by using a structure known as a line item. So a line item is really an item used in a specific transaction. And you can see from the schema here that it contains information about quantities and status, things like price. The transaction determines the actual price of the item. Then there is the component that identifies the item in the transaction. And we also allow for the possibility of having subline items. In other words, a recursive hierarchy of line items for describing things like bills of material. So here's two examples of where line item is reused, in a quotation and in an order. So you can see at the top one, the quotation, we have information about the line item, but we also allow in a quote to propose a substitute or an alternative line item. In a order, then you may provide a line item, you may provide this seller proposed or the buyer proposed line item or a substitute line item. So we've talked about parties and items and line items, transactions, and let's look now about fulfillment. How, once we've got these items identified in transactions, how are they delivered? And the delivery process is really a link between what I refer to as the logistics supply chain and the commercial supply chain, the transport and the procurement parts. So this is where they join together. UBL allows deliveries to be identified at a document level. In other words, this delivery applies to the whole transaction or at specific line items. So there may be split deliveries where on a particular shipment, the deliveries may be split. There is a separate video tutorial dealing with transportation in a use case that goes into much greater depth about how this works. But for now, let me just show you what a delivery structure looks like. So delivery is concerned with quantities, clearly, with dates and times, with locations, and then what's called the shipment itself. And that the shipment is what describes the item and how it is packed. The rest of this is really what you would expect to see in terms of a delivery note, for example. Here's an example of delivery where there's a specific date that a product or an item is required. In this case, the 20th of November 2008. Really should update these dates. The next example is slightly more complicated. It deals with an actual delivery date and it's got a specific delivery address. This is actually a Danish address, and it identifies the party who is going to take delivery of this item. In the same way as how the delivery information links together the logistic and the commercial supply chain, the payment information links together the commercial and the financial supply chain. Often in the banking industry, they refer to the commercial as the upstream process and the financial transactions, the exchange of funds, as the downstream process. But the concept is the same. It's important to recognize UBL does not attempt to describe the data interchanges between financial institutions. That's well covered by other standards such as ISO 2022. What UBL strives to do is provide the information for the transactions used in those other processes. So in the European context, UBL provides placeholders for information required by the single European payment authority. It's a useful function for applications or information systems if they are able to take a UBL invoice and extract the information necessary to go into a payment instruction for the banking system. And equally as well, if the banking system can provide the information that then feeds into a UBL remittance advice. So you can see that the UBL transactions are really between the buyer and seller. And that's the information that we need to know. Nothing to do with between the buyer and their bank, or the seller and their bank. We can't deal with payment without talking about currency. Currency information always uses the ISO 4217 3-character alphabetic currency code. Different currencies may apply to different parts of a transaction. So we can have a currency for the documentation, we can have a currency for tax, prices, or even alternative payments. And in the example shown at the bottom here, we're seeing where the document currency is Swedish krona, but the tax is payable in Danish krona. So the other way in which currency comes into play is every time there is an amount element. So every time we specify an amount within UBL, a monetary amount, we have to also provide the currency code. And again, it's the same ISO 4217 alpha currency code. To ensure that the monetary totals in a UBL transaction are unambiguous, there is a monetary total structure. This can either be used in an anticipation sense of this is what I expect the monetary total to be, or in a legally binding sense of, for example, an invoice. So we define things like the line extension amount to be the total of all the line extension amounts in the various transactions, net of tax and settlement discounts, but including any applicable rounding amount. So there is a very precise definition of each of these elements. And probably the most commonly occurring, and in fact the one that's mandatory, is the payable amount, which is the total amount to be paid. It's the, in a legally binding sense, that's the debt. So here's an example of a monetary total where there is a line extension of 5,050 Danish kroner, which is without tax 4,262.50. Total with tax is 6,312.50, and the total amount payable is 6,312.50. We can't deal with monetary amounts without dealing with totals, without dealing with allowances and charges. Allowances and charges in UBL share the same structure. Allowances are discounts or rebates, and charges are additional amounts. And again, as with the other payment information, they can apply to the whole document or to specific transactions. So this is what the allowance and charge structure looks like. There's an indicator to show if this is an allowance or a charge, and a reason, either in code or text form, for describing what it is. And then, of course, there is the amounts themselves and any taxes that may be applicable. Here's an example of what's called a loyal customer discount. So this is an allowance. It's 800 Danish kroner. And it apparently has some tax implication. So it looks as though there is a 25% tax payable on this. So let's talk a little bit about tax. It is again a critical component of any commercial transaction. And tax in the UBL world covers three domains. Tax information about the party, which tends to be stable and applies to a party over its lifetime. Tax information that applies to an item, a particular goods or services that have different tax categories. And then tax information applied to transactions. So when this party deals with this item, this is the tax information that applies. So the structure to describe the tax scheme a party participates in, and there may be many. Here is the party tax scheme type. So this is the party tax scheme schema. Unfortunate naming, really. This identifies the company in terms of this tax scheme. So typically speaking, this would be the VAT identification number or whatever it's called in your country, how this country has been registered for tax. And this is the tax jurisdiction identification number. Equally, if the party is exempt, we need to explain that the party is exempt from tax. And then there is a further structure, tax scheme, that provides more detail about the specific tax categories that apply here. So let's have a look at tax scheme. Tax scheme describes an overall category, like whether it's a sales tax or a consumption tax, and typically this relates to a piece of government legislation, a piece of law. And there may be many rates that apply to this particular tax scheme. Tax schemes typically apply to countries, but we recognise that some have jurisdiction that is less than a country, and some have jurisdiction that's more than one country. So here's an example of some party tax schemes. This is the Danish moms, the value-added tax that applies in Denmark. Is the top one. And the second one, and this applies to this Danish company, registered DK, whatever they are, their company identifier. In the UK, the company IYT Corporation has a VAT number of 1234567 and that's how we recognise the tax scheme. I mentioned that tax schemes can have multiple categories, and the category is really what determines the rate, normally a percentage, but possibly a fixed amount of tax that applies to that category. Tax categories not only apply to items, but as we saw in the previous example, allowances and charges can have tax categories as well. And you'll see in this schema here that it references the tax scheme that it applies to. There is a percentage, a per unit or a base unit measure, again exemption reasons if there are any, and possibly a tier range. Here's an example of a tax category. UK VAT, category A, 17.5%. Finally, when we talk about tax, we need to talk about how it applies to a specific transaction. So now we're talking about the application of a tax scheme to a particular transaction. And we deal with tax totals and tax subtotals. So the amount of tax for a specific tax category is a tax subtotal, because clearly there could be multiple taxes applied to a transaction. Each tax subtotal has obviously a taxable amount and an identification of the category that it comes from. Here's an example. We saw before that category A, tax category A, is UK VAT 17.5%, and in this transaction that equates to a taxable amount of £100, equates to a tax amount of £17.50. All of the tax subtotals accumulate into what's called the tax total. And that tax total structure that we're looking at here has all of the tax subtotals and any rounding amount that may apply, and a specific tax amount that is the total of all tax categories. Here's an example extending again. We saw the VAT 17.5%. We saw that it applied to a tax subtotal where there was £100 taxable, and the total in this example is at £17.50 as well. So there is no other taxes applied to this transaction. Finally, one of the most common structures reused in UBL is the document reference, and that's because when we're dealing with a supply chain or a business process, there is a need to identify the state of the collaboration. So which order were you referring to, which forwarding instruction, which response, which catalogue? All of these things require us to refer to other documents. They're useful for both synchronizing the transactions, coordinating a supply chain, but also in terms of audit and control. When things go wrong, we need to find out where things are. So UBL uses a structure known as document reference. Document reference has an identification of documents called an ID, but it also has this thing called a UUID, which is a universally unique identifier. So these are typically computer-generated numbers that are issued every time there's a new transaction instance. So if you issue a duplicate, a copy of the order, in this case, or ID number, you will get the same ID number but a different UUID. So it's a version stamp as well. So when we talk about document reference, we need to talk about how we identify them. So I've mentioned that there is an identifier that's typically for manual understanding, and also a UUID, a computer-generated one, which is much commonly used for computer application matching. The copy indicator false means that this is the original copy and there's a date of issue. Now, it's one thing to identify the document, and we've done that in the previous example, but sometimes we need to locate it. We need to say, where is the document? Where can I find a copy of the document you're referring to? And one way you can do this with XML is you can actually specify what's called the XPath, the address within the document where the other document that you're referring to exists. It's often used for things like digital signatures. And let me show you an example of this. So, originator document reference, here is the identifier, and this is a path, what's called an XPath, that is an address that points you to the XML code where the reference document is defined. So you would look, or your computer application would look at that address to find a copy of the XML that defines the the document reference. You can also attach a document. And again, this is a common way of doing it, and there are two ways. One is what we call attach by inclusion. So you embed the entire document inside your XML document. It's formatted as what's called a binary object, and that means it can support any type of text encoding. UBL doesn't care what type of document you're attaching here. It could be anything. The second option is to locate by external reference. In other words, you point to an external place where this document exists. So that's how attachments work, and this is the attachment structure, either embedded document or external reference. This is an example of an embedded document, a document called tele-1-con. It is a copy. You can see from the attachment it's a PDF file, and it's encoded here in base 64 as an attachment. Obviously it's much larger than this, but to make it visible we've shortened it greatly. And finally, there's referencing external documents. So the external reference structure contains things like URI and document hashes and all the various properties you might need to know if you're to actually open and read this document, like how is it formatted, what's it encoded, what's its file name, what's its description, what character set does it use. If it is somehow encrypted, is there a hash algorithm that applies to it? And is there an expiry date and time? So these are all important information about external documents. And here's an example using a URI, which is a web address for the document, a hash total, so you can check its integrity and make sure it hasn't been corrupted in some way, and an expiry date. Thank you very much. That ends the tutorial on UBL structures.